Hi everyone, welcome to the lecture for today. Once again, it's Dr. Emma Diaz. I wanted to record this to make sure y'all still had access to the lecture like you typically would, since I'm not in the office this week. We are going to be talking about biopsychology today, which is pretty much about the brain. This is a chapter that is very dense. So it's a lot of information, material, and things to memorize. So if you find yourself getting a little overwhelmed or something like that, please just pause, come back to it when you need. This is a great chapter to watch all of the videos. The PowerPoint will be up in the section. So regardless of if you have in person or watching this, you can watch the videos on your own time. And this is a chapter that it might even be good to watch some extra YouTube videos because there are some folks online that can talk about these things in ways that are interesting and a little less dense, especially if this is sort of their area of focus. This is a very niche area of focus. So I'm not going to go through all of the videos because you'll have access to those on your own. So we're just going to go through the content. So like I said, this is chapter 3, biopsychology. We are not going to cover chapter or section 3.1. We're going to start with talking about neurons and the body's wiring. So the nervous system is comprised of two main parts, which are neurons and glial cells, also known as glia. Neurons are the most basic type of nerve cell, and these are responsible for sending and receiving messages within the nervous system. And in the neurons, we have basic parts that are responsible for different things. So this is a video you can watch. You'll have access to this on the PowerPoint. We're going to go over this in greater depth, but this is the structure of the neuron. So you see the dendrites, the axon hillock, the cell nucleus, the body, and then we have this part, which is the axon, followed by the terminal buttons. And we're going to explain what all of that is in just a second, but this is a piece of the PowerPoint that it might be good to jump back and forth to as you're looking at the different parts of the neuron. So the soma is the cell body, and that's the part that contains the nucleus. And this is really the part of the neuron that contains the metabolic or life-sustaining functions of the cell. So this is the part that keeps the cell basically alive. The axon is the long cable projecting from the soma. So if you look at this, right, we have kind of the soma, and then the axon is the part that extends from that. And that carries the neural impulses to the terminal buttons. And the terminal buttons are the swellings at the end of the axons, and these release chemicals, which are called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters basically are messengers. So they carry these messages to neurons next to them. And these are the terminal buttons, which are the parts that release that. And then we have the dendrites, and these are the fibers that project from the soma and they receive the messages. So those are these parts, and these are the parts of the neuron that actually receive the messages. So it kind of starts here in the soma, travels through the axon, gets released by the terminal buttons to the neuron next door, which is captured by these dendrites. So if you think about it, this is like if you all have ever played the game of telephone when you're young, right? And you say something and then it gets passed from person to person. So this is kind of, the dendrite is basically you receiving it, someone whispering in your ear, and then you pass it along. And as you are saying the message, you're at kind of the terminal button. This is what the neuron looks like. It's just another example of what the neuron looks like. So we have the soma, the dendrites, the axon, and then the terminal buttons at the end. This is just a little bit of extra information. This is what we already went over, but this is really, like I said, this is something that is a lot of memorization and just getting used to the terms. These are really good things to know because this is telling you how your brain works how you process information, how you receive information. And so you may not need to know like what a soma is in the future, but there are going to be different disorders and things we're talking about today, and you're going to get an understanding of why things impact the brain and how information passes through the brain. So a lot of it is going to be memorization, but this is just good stuff to know in general. So once again, the soma is the cell body, and that carries out the cell's metabolic functions, which basically keep it alive. The axon is that tube that carries messages to other neurons. Can be a few thousandths of an inch to several feet long, depending on where it is. And then we have the terminal buttons. The terminal buttons are what releases the neurotransmitter to where it can be picked up by the neuron next door, and then it gets picked up at the dendrites, which are branching structures. If you think about like a tree, the dendrites are kind of the leaves of the tree, and they collect the information coming in. And there are 3 different primary types of neurons, and they all have different functions. So sensory neurons are neurons that transmit information from organs, muscles, and inner organs to the brain and spinal cord. So they're responsible for transmitting information from sensory organs into the brain and spinal cord. So they're how you get some of the information. And then on the other hand, we have motor neurons, which are the neurons that convey the nerve impulses from the central nervous system, brain area, to the muscles and glands. So when you go to do something like move your hand, raise your hand, kick a ball, whatever it is, those are those motor neurons coming from your central nervous system and moving out to tell your muscles like, hey, we want you to move this way, or we want you to move that way. And then interneurons are nerve cells in the nervous system that actually process the information. And interneurons connect neurons to other neurons. So in the spinal cord, for instance, they connect sensory neurons to motor neurons. So let's say you feel something hot and you want to move your hand, right? First, you have to have that sensation register with your brain. Your brain says, oh, wow, that's really hot. And it sends the motor neurons back out to move it away. Now that seems like a complicated process, right? Because you have to feel the temperature, register that it's too hot, and then move away. It's a multi-step process, but this happens almost immediately. That is how fast this system works. It works so fast that it's an immediate reaction, even though you are having the initial sensation of how it feels. It's getting carried up into your brain. Your brain is processing that information, and then your motor neurons kick in action, start moving based on that information. So it's a lot of steps, but it happens really, really fast. And then we have the glial cells. These serve a supportive role physically and metabolically. And their job is to support the neurons, and they form the myelin sheath, which, as we're going to talk about, is really, really important. This is something you really don't want to go wrong, is the myelin sheath. And so glial cells are basically the glue that holds neurons together. If you picture just like a glue gun, right? That's what they do. They hold neurons together, they support them, and they make sure things are working in the way that they need to work. And they also do other things like remove waste products. They're basically what keeps these neurons functioning. So the myelin sheath is a protective insulation. And what it does is it covers the axons and helps speed the transmission of nerve impulses. So it's like insulation that covers electrical wires. And what this insulation does is it allows the muscles to move really efficiently and very smoothly. So this myelin sheath is this protective cover that helps things travel efficiently and smoothly along. And then we have these gaps in the myelin sheath called the nodes of Ranvier, and those increase the efficiency of the transmission. So when you're thinking about the myelin sheath and the nodes, what you're going to see is that this part of it, this outside protective covering, see how it almost looks like little teeth on it? That's the myelin sheath right here. And that protects the axon. It makes sure that it's safe, structurally works well. And then you have this little node right here, which is where the myelin sheath breaks apart, just for a second. And what I want you to picture when you picture the myelin sheath and the nodes of Ranvier is I want you to picture if you've ever skipped rocks, right? When you skip a rock, it doesn't slide across the surface of the water like an ice skating rink, right? It doesn't do that. It skips over. And that's what makes it move so fast, is that it hits and skips and hits and skips and hits and skips. And that's why it goes so quickly. And so I want you to keep that in mind. That essentially is what this is doing. It's hitting and skipping and hitting and skipping, hitting over things, just like when you skip a rock in the lake. It looks very similar, right? So it's kind of going through and it's helping the message transmit quickly and efficiently. When we don't have that efficient process, we have issues. Our myelin sheath is not something we want to mess around with. So multiple sclerosis is one disease in the central nervous system. About 1 in 1,000 adults have it. And this is when your body's immune system destroys the myelin sheath. So there are times, I'm sure y'all have heard about these. This is any kind of autoimmune disease, right? Is when your immune system doesn't recognize something as belonging to you and it attacks it. So in this case, in multiple sclerosis, your body's immune system begins to attack the myelin sheath. And this generally affects people between 20 to 40 years of age. That's kind of the range it's most likely to affect you or start affecting you. And it's believed that it's genetically influenced. I believe we're going to talk about MS a little bit later on as well. So when we think about how neurons communicate, right, we have the soma traveling down the axon, releasing by the terminal buttons and getting picked up by the dendrites. And then we know that the axon helps information travel quickly and efficiently because of the myelin sheath and the nodes of Ranvier. Very similar to skipping rocks, this message is going to go quickly across. This is another video. This will be in the PowerPoint, so make sure to take a look. A lot of these videos are going to be really helpful because some of these people, like, this is what they do all day, every day. And so they're going to be able to explain this in even more depth. And you're really going to get a better understanding just the more interaction you have with these terms. Because for a lot of folks, like, this is really new stuff. I have my PhD in psychology. I had to take a few classes similar to this. And if you don't study this commonly, it's very confusing. There's a lot of terms. It doesn't always make sense. So as many videos as you can watch, it's really going to help make sense of things. Now, when we think of how neurons actually communicate to each other, there's this thing called resting potential. And that's when the neuron isn't doing anything. It's just kind of dormant and it's inactive. What happens is there's this positive shift in electrical charge that happens. And so when the neuron begins to experience this positive shift, it gets less negatively charged. And when it reaches a certain point, it fires. And that's called depolarization or an action potential. So when this neuron depolarizes, we get an action potential, which is when the cell actually fires. So the action potential is when the impulse of positive charge actually runs down the axon, right? There's actual information that's being passed. And with action potentials, there's this all or none principle. So dendrites either receive enough of a signal from the neurotransmitters to cause an action potential, or the neuron doesn't fire at all. But it's either or. You cannot have a neuron that only partially fires. That doesn't happen. You can have the message get a little bit muddy if the myelin sheath isn't working as well, right? But it's still firing fully at that point. It is still firing correctly. The transmission is just what's off. So either it fires, the message fires, or it doesn't fire. It's all or none. I want you to picture like a light switch coming on and off, right? Either the light is on or it's off. And you know, when you do the light switch, you can get it to a certain point where it's kind of in the middle, and then something will click and it'll turn on. You can't partially turn on a light that's on a light switch. It's on or it's off. It's the same thing with an action potential. And here's another video. I encourage y'all to watch these. You can either pause this and go to the PowerPoints and watch them there, or you can watch them all together at the end. But I don't know if the sound will work correctly, so I don't want to play all of them and have the sound not work correctly. So the synapse is the junction where information gets transmitted from one neuron to another. And the neuron that sends a signal across the gap is called the presynaptic neuron. And the neuron that receives the signal is called the postsynaptic neuron. So you have the pre part that's sending the information, and then you have the post part that's receiving the information. Very similar to like sending a piece of mail, right? Like you have the sender and the receiver. The sender is the presynaptic neuron. The receiver is the postsynaptic neuron. And neurotransmitters are what we're actually sending. Like neurotransmitters are the piece of mail, and these are chemical messengers that activate neighboring neurons. So here we see the synapse and the synaptic gap, right? And then we have the presynaptic gap where it's coming out of, and the postsynaptic gap where it's getting picked up from. We have the synaptic vesicles and then these neurotransmitter molecules just hanging out. And the neurotransmitters get released when an action potential causes the sacs or vesicles to spill the neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. And then after they're released, neurotransmitters diffuse across the synaptic cleft to the membrane of the receiving cell, which stimulates, like we talked about, the receiving or postsynaptic cell. And then that has an action potential of its own. Now, after an action potential fires, the neuron needs to reset itself, which means it has to return to its resting state. We got a typo. It has to return to its resting state. So essentially, this has to happen before the neuron can fire again. So it's almost like if you were to run a really long distance and you reach the end of you being able to run it, you can't just continue running, right? You have to rest, you have to sit down, you have to take a break before you can go again. So that is what happens is the neuron is physically unable to fire again until it resets itself. And that's this idea of a refractory period. This is a brief period of time. It's temporary. It's not permanent. But during this temporary state, this brief period of time, if the neuron gets stimulated again, it is not going to generate an action potential. This neuron is unable to fire. So even if it's getting all the stimulation in the world, it cannot fire. This is a diagram of how this looks. I would encourage you to take a look. It talks more about the resting state, the shift, the action potentials. So I just encourage you to look this over in greater depth. There's a few diagrams in here, and they're going to be really helpful as you're trying to figure out what all of this looks like, because a lot of the material in this feels, the brain is so essential to everything that we do when you move your hands, when you choose to say a word, when you like go to sleep, whatever it is, your brain is essential to all of those things. And yet when we zoom in on the brain, a lot of times it can feel very pulled apart from everything else. So these diagrams are going to help you as you're trying to navigate, like, what does this mean? What does this look like? So we have the neuron in a resting state, getting stimulated. The sodium gates in the cell start to open, and then these positive sodium ions rush into the cell. And when there's enough stimulation, the cell shifts from a negative charge to a positive charge. And this reversal of the charge, like we talked about, is called an action potential. You can also refer to it as a neural impulse, right? And like we talked about, this is essentially shooting down the axon, just like that game of telephone, reversing all of the charges along the membrane. And once it passes, those gates close. And so you can't get that inflow of sodium ions again. And then the cell pumps out those positively charged ions, which are mostly potassium. I don't think that you'll need to know the exact, like, sodium, potassium, things like that. It might be good to know, but I really want you to keep in mind just like what the mechanism is that's happening. And what happens at that point is it restores the negative charge, taking it back to the resting state so that it can fire again. Because remember, it can't fire until it resets itself and gets back to that negative state. And sodium and potassium are really the two pieces that are most important to the action potential. So we have that neural impulse that travels along the axon, sending that information towards the next neuron. And then the neurons are released from these vesicles, these tiny little sacs, in the terminal buttons of the sending neuron. And then these chemical messages travel along the synaptic gap to the dendrites of the receiving neuron. And these neurotransmitter chemicals that don't dock at the receptor sites basically get decomposed in this gap or reabsorbed in a process called reuptake. If any of you have heard of SSRIs, right? Simple serotonin reuptake inhibitor. I think it's simple serotonin, but it's a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And what it does is it basically causes this reuptake process to happen, right? So if it doesn't get taken by the next neuron, it either decomposes or gets tossed back up. And we're going to talk a little bit about when things go wrong with our neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are something that we really, really want to work right. If we think about our body as an organism, right, everything needs to work right in order for our bodies to be in sync and harmony and to work the way they're supposed to. So when we get a disruption in something, it can really, really impact our functioning, and it can have a huge impact on us. These can often cause psychological concerns. Dopamine is one that's been studied over and over again. And they found that our dopamine system, it's just really important that it works correctly. So when you have an overactive dopamine system, we think that this is what's causing schizophrenia symptoms and hallucination-like symptoms. So people with schizophrenia are more likely often to have an overactive dopamine system, which means we're getting too much dopamine release and too much dopamine in those postsynaptic dendrites that are getting taken up. On the other hand, we also don't want it to be an underactive system. So when we have underactivity, when we're not releasing enough dopamine, we get things like Parkinson's disease. And so we have medications that can help either activate this, which is an agonist, or inhibit this process, which is an antagonist. So if we need to increase it, we call that agonist therapy. We would do that if we're not getting enough, like in Parkinson's disease. Whereas if we need to inhibit it, this would be an antagonist. And this would be something we might use in something like schizophrenia, where we're getting too much of it. So psychoactive drugs can either be agonists or antagonists. And like we said, an agonist mimics the neurotransmitter at the receptor site, and an antagonist blocks or impedes the activity of the neurotransmitter at the receptor site. So on the one hand, the agonist is making this process happen more easily and having more of the process happen, whereas an antagonist is blocking the process from happening. And really what we're doing if you're getting prescribed an agonist or an antagonist is we're trying to correct that underlying imbalance that's going on. Not all things are caused by a chemical imbalance, but when they are, you may find that other things are going to be less likely. There are things that are really most treatable through medication if it's a neurochemical imbalance. So when we think about Parkinson's disease, this is a progressive nervous system disorder. This happens when people have low levels of dopamine. So their levels are not at the average level, they're underneath that. And the most common treatment strategy that we have at this time is to use dopamine agonists, which help mimic the effects of dopamine. So essentially the same process is happening, but with something that's not natural to the body. We're implementing it on purpose to try to get more of that same effect by having it bind to dopamine receptors. And so these are some very common neurotransmitters in like movement and psychological things to consider. So acetylcholine is involved in muscle action and memory. It can increase your arousal or increase your cognition so that you're better able to focus. Beta endorphins are involved in pain and pleasure. These can help decrease anxiety and decrease tension. If y'all have ever seen Legally Blonde, right? She is trying to convince the jury that the woman didn't do it. And one thing she says is that she works out. And so the woman has endorphins, and endorphins make her happy. And happy people don't kill their husbands. So there's this idea, right? Endorphins are sort of these natural pleasure centers, so they can decrease anxiety, decrease tension. Then we have dopamine. Dopamine is involved in mood, sleep, learning. And this includes things like increasing pleasure and suppressing appetite. GABA is involved in brain function and sleep, and it can be responsible for decreasing anxiety and decreasing tension. Glutamate is involved in learning and can be involved in increasing learning and enhancing your memory. Norepinephrine is essential to your heart, intestines, and just like general level of alertness. So it can increase your arousal and suppress your appetite. And serotonin is also involved in mood and sleep, and it can help modulate your mood or suppress your appetite. You do have to be careful with certain we're not going to get into the nuances of all of this, but there are certain medications, right, that can be used to increase your mood. But let's say that you're working with someone who has an eating disorder and they're underweight. You have to be careful with some of these, that you're not prescribing something that's going to better moderate their mood, but is also going to decrease their appetite. So you have to be sure that what you're giving someone is doing the right mix of things. So we're just going to go over a few in more detail, not a ton. But dopamine, like we talked about, this one is really, really important. So we think that irregularities in this might be associated with addictive disorders. And the idea there is that it's possible that when folks are using substances, they're sort of getting artificial dopamine into their system. So this can work in a few different ways. One way might be that people who have addictions aren't taking in as much dopamine naturally as they should be. And so maybe they're trying to compensate in that way. It might also be the case that people who use substances, we know that it disrupts their brain activity and their kind of sense of homeostasis and how things should be functioning. So it's possible if someone has been, and this is shown actually, that if someone has been using substances over and over and over time, the normal things that might increase dopamine, like food, sex, pleasurable things, those aren't going to activate dopamine in the same way because their body is used to getting higher doses of dopamine from those substances. So they might have more tolerance to dopamine. It's not quite working as it should. And we know that decreased levels of dopamine are related to motor tremors, and that's related to Parkinson's disease, right? So that really what dopamine causes, we believe, in Parkinson's disease is it's really related to those motor tremors. And then in schizophrenia, we see those increased levels are more related to hallucinations. That's kind of the symptom in particular we associate with dopamine. Norepinephrine can be associated with depressive disorders, as well as serotonin is also related to depressive disorders. Serotonin also likely has a relationship with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and eating disorders as well. And GABA is related to anxiety disorders. So when we see low levels of GABA, we might be seeing an increase in anxiety disorders. We're going to talk a little bit about the nervous system now. The nervous system is one of my favorite things to talk about in this section because the parts of the brain to me can be a little dry. Like I said, those are just things that you have to learn to memorize and learn how to know them. But the nervous system, really when we're thinking about the nervous system helps us explain why certain things activate us, why certain things get our heart rate pumping. It also helps explain why when we get in an argument with our partner, we say things we don't mean, we do things we don't mean, we slam the kitchen counter and kitchen cabinet, and we don't want to do that. So the nervous system is very related to all of these things, and it can really help explain why we behave the way we behave. So the nervous system is this network of nerve cells and support cells, and they're responsible for communicating and processing information from within and outside of the body. The different parts of the nervous system each have a different role to play. So it's kind of like on a football team. I don't know a lot about football. I know more about soccer. So I guess on a soccer team, right, you have your defense that's responsible for making sure the ball doesn't go in, isn't on the offensive third. They want to get it back to the midfield or offense. You have the goalie that's responsible ultimately for making sure the ball doesn't go in the goal. They're sort of the last line of defense. Then you have the midfielders. Their job is really to get the ball on the offensive third, and then their job is to score, right? So just like all of the parts of a soccer team have a specialized role and do something a little bit different, all of the parts of the nervous system also have a specialized role and they do something different too. So really they work together to regulate body processes. Things like respiration and heart rate, things like body movement, things like sensing the world and performing higher mental function. So this is kind of what makes us a human. So we have the central nervous system, right? The brain and spinal cord, and this is kind of your body's master control. So your central nervous system is responsible for regulating everything in your body. I want you right now to notice how often, since you've been listening to this lecture, have you been purposefully telling your heart to pump? The answer hopefully is not at all. To my understanding, you can't make your heart pump or not pump, right? It happens naturally. It is regulated on its own. The movement of your eye as you read, right? And these higher mental processes, all of these things are regulated by your central nervous system. It is invaluable to you. You could not survive without it. And not only could you not survive without it, you wouldn't be able to make sense of the world around you without it. So we have our brain and the spinal cord as the two core components of the central nervous system. The spinal cord is this column of thick nerves. It's about as thick as your thumb, which if you think about nerves, right, like that's pretty thick. And it travels from the base of your brain all the way down your spine. And what it does is it helps to facilitate communication between your brain and the rest of your body, or the peripheral nervous system. So it really helps carry the information from your brain down to your body. And it organizes reflexes as well. It might involve as few as a few neurons, and that can be life-saving. Thinking about like pulling your hand off the hot stove, right? Jerking your hand off a curling iron, things that are very, very quick. They're happening very fast. Then we have our peripheral nervous system. So these are more like these blue lines, right? So the peripheral nervous system connects the brain and spinal cord with things like your sensory organs, your muscles, your glands. So just like your brain needs to communicate to the rest of your body what to do, the rest of your body also needs to communicate with your brain so that your brain understands what messages to send and and what information it needs to use to make a decision. So without your peripheral nervous system, right, your brain would be like a computer chip that's disconnected. It has a lot of power, it has a lot of possibility, but it doesn't know what to do. So your peripheral nervous system is sending information to your brain as well so that your brain can process it and can make accurate decisions, can decide what it needs to do. And really its job is to connect the nervous system to the rest of your body, including sensory organs, muscles, and glands. And it has two different parts. It has the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system transmits information from the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and the sensory organs and muscles. And it controls a lot of voluntary movements. Then the autonomic nervous system is involved in regulating a lot of involuntary processes, things like breathing, heart rate, digestion. You should not have had to tell yourself to breathe in the past hour, in the past 5 hours, right? You will be doing it naturally. Just like you don't tell your body to digest food, it knows what to do and it does it naturally. You see the word autonomic looks very similar to the word automatic, right? And it's this idea that these are things that are happening automatically. They are outside of your conscious control. You are not thinking, I need my heart to beat right now. Your heart is just beating. This is what it does naturally. And so in the autonomic nervous system, which is sort of that automatic system, there are two divisions that work together, but they're kind of the opposite. So the sympathetic nervous system is more what's responsible for fight or flight, and this accelerates body processes. So this is the part of your body that releases energy stores to meet the demands of whatever you need. Very similar to putting a gas pedal on the car. When a crisis occurs, it activates your body. It needs to activate your body. Then on the other hand, we have the parasympathetic nervous system. This is our rest and digest system. So this is responsible for regulating processes that replenish your energy stores so you can use them when you need them. And it's very similar to the brake pedals on a car. After an emergency is over, it helps you slow back down. So when you think of how to separate these two, oftentimes what I've been taught and what helps me is to remember thinking about your parasympathetic nervous system like a parachute, in that it helps you come back down, right? So you're parachuting back down. Your parasympathetic nervous system is helping you parachute back down. So if you think about this, let's say that someone starts chasing you out of nowhere. You're walking down the street, someone starts chasing you. They're going to try to rob you or something. Your sympathetic nervous system needs to kick in. It has to kick in. It is what's responsible for taking that energy and saying, oh shit, we got to use this. We got to get this somewhere. Like she needs or he needs or they need to be running. So it shuts off other parts of your body so that you can focus on getting away. You need your sympathetic nervous system. You equally need your parasympathetic nervous system because you can't keep running forever, right? So you get to where you're going and then you need to re-regulate. You need to do things like digest the food that you had eaten before. If you had just eaten a meal, then somebody, starts chasing you, your body is going to stop digesting that food because it's going to say, we don't need to digest this food right now. We need to use the energy we already have and get them away from here. But then after you're done with that, you need to go back to digesting that food, right? You need your body to parachute back down and to help you replenish your stores and just re-regulate. So the sympathetic nervous system can get a bad rap. A lot of folks have trouble regulating their sympathetic nervous system when they have mental health diagnoses, right? Things like PTSD. If you have PTSD, your sympathetic nervous system is kicking on and on and on and on all the time, even when it doesn't need to. If you have anxiety, things might elevate your blood pressure that you don't want to be, right? Things like looking on Instagram and seeing a message from someone, or thinking about your upcoming test or things like that. It's overactivated. So the sympathetic nervous system can get a bad rap. We kind of like the parasympathetic rest and digest better, right? It feels better, but we need both of them. One of them isn't bad. One of them isn't good. They both serve a function. And our goal is just to make sure that we're using the right ones at the right time. Nowadays, oftentimes what happens in the past is we had, when we were a hunter-gatherer society, the things that would activate our sympathetic nervous system were real threats to our life. Nowadays, kind of existential threats can activate them too, right? Things like if you were to be kicked out of your community in a hunter-gatherer society, you would die. You would not make it. Your sympathetic nervous system needs to kick on to help you. Nowadays, you could be okay, but your sympathetic nervous system still kicks on anyway, right? So a lot of what meditation, therapies, things like that can do is help you learn to re-regulate these so that they're acting in balance with one another like they're designed to do. And here we see that these are basically just doing the opposite, right? So our sympathetic nervous system, when it kicks on, it's increasing air to our lungs. Whereas when we're parachuting back down, it's constricting the bronchi, so it's not increasing any air. Over at the sympathetic, we get that it's accelerating our heartbeat, right? Oftentimes when we're in danger, when something's going on, when we need to be active, we need our heart rate to be higher. But then we parachute back down and our heart rate can slow again. We don't need to digest our food when we're in the middle of a life and death situation, when something is really stressful. Digesting our food is not a priority, but we do need to do it when we come back down, right? So we see all of these contracting vessels, dilating vessels, inhibiting bladder contraction, contracting bladder. So we're seeing the opposite things happening. Like I said, both of these, both sides are essential. We just need to have them happening at the right times. We're going to talk a little bit about the brain. Here's another video that's going to tell you about the different parts of the brain. Another video to help get to know your brain more. This is another area where I highly encourage you to like, please watch the videos and pay attention to them. This is essentially a website. You'll have it on the PowerPoint that you can go to where it will take you to a 3D version of the brain. So, I might encourage you as you're watching this, take a pause, go to this website, and as we're talking about the different parts of the brain, like pull them up on the 3D brain so you can see where they are and what they look like. Because it really does make a difference to be able to just see what it looks like, what's going on. All right, so the brain essentially has two hemispheres. And when we think about the brain, oftentimes one thing that comes up is the cerebral cortex. And this is the surface of the brain. It is uneven. It's characterized by a distinctive pattern, which is folds, also called gyri, or a gyrus if it's just one, and grooves, which is sulci or sulcus. I don't specialize in the brain, so I'm not sure if it's sulcus or sulcus. And the most prominent one of this is the longitudinal fissure. And this is a deep groove that separates the two hemispheres of the brain that we talked about. The brain has two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. I'm sure you have all heard overly simplified examples of this, right? If you're a right brain person, you're going to be X, Y, or Z. If you're a left brain person, you're going to be X, Y, or Z. These types of people are creative. These types of people are logical. That's an oversimplification for what the brain is. There may be some general patterns, but really the brain is so complex and you can't tell, what hemisphere is dominant based on like something so simple. When we think about those two hemispheres, there has to be a way to connect them. So there's this thick band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres. It's over 200 million axons, which is huge. So this is a huge band of neural fibers. And what it does, allows the two hemispheres to communicate with one another. So we have these two hemispheres in our brain. They've done some studies. I'll see if maybe I can find an extra video to pop in at some point. I don't think it's on here already. But they've done studies with people where their corpus callosum is essentially like gone or non-functional, or there's been some sort of damage to it. And they've found some really interesting studies where people can like point to the right answer, but they can't say the right answer because their brain isn't able to communicate. So even though they're processing the information, it's only getting processed in one side. So they can still function in several ways, but there's like key things that they can't do. And so what we really need, what a functioning brain looks like, is it looks like being able to share the information with all of the sides of it. These are some of the major structures. We're going to go over these in depth in just a second. So looking at the forebrain, this is the largest part of our brain, and it contains several structures. So one of those structures is the thalamus, and this is the relay station that directs sensory information to its appropriate processing center. So think about the relay station as those really annoying call centers where you call and it will tell you, if you need to get a hold of billing, click 1. If you need to get a hold of your representative, pick 2, right? Your thalamus is essentially that same idea of that call center in that it relays sensory information to the appropriate part. It also plays a role in wakefulness and sleep states. And then we have our hypothalamus. Our hypothalamus is responsible for regulating a lot of really, really important functions, things like body temperature and reproduction. And it's responsible for things like emotional states, aggression, how we respond to stress. So a lot of emotional components to it. And the limbic system includes the hippocampus, the amygdala, and parts of the thalamus and hypothalamus. So there's a lot of, you'll see this in this section, there's a lot of sharing, right? For the most part, we can't say this one part is responsible for all of your emotions, right? because our emotions are impacted by our memory, and our memory is impacted by our ability to pay attention. And our ability to pay attention is related to us being able to take in information from our senses, like our eyes and our ears, and make sense of that. So what you're going to see is there's a lot of overlap in a lot of things. It is very uncommon that only one part does only one thing. So limbic system, hippocampus, amygdala, parts of the thalamus and hypothalamus. And this is largely responsible for memory and emotional processing. So the amygdala is involved in aggression, rage, fear, emotions. It's also responsible for activating that fight or flight. The amygdala is the part of your brain when you get in an argument with your spouse or your partner or your mom or whoever it is, and you feel your emotions just take over completely. That's your amygdala. Your amygdala isn't responsible for thinking about, like, I wonder how they're going to react to this. I wonder what damage this might do to our relationship. Your amygdala is just straight emotion. So your amygdala oftentimes too, it develops first throughout our lifespan. So your amygdala develops before your ability to think and reason and plan. So your amygdala is, I always think about this when I think about those cute toddler videos where they're just all emotion, and you try to tell them something like, hey, like, you need to put on sunscreen, and they're just sobbing about it. This is because their amygdala is starting to develop before their ability to reason and think. And so they're all emotion. So this is one of the reasons why one of the best things you can do if you say mean things when you get into fights with other people, if you do things you regret, you do things that are risky or things that aren't healthy for you, one of the best things that you're going to learn to do is to pause and take a break to let your amygdala become less active. Because you cannot think through what you're doing unless your amygdala becomes less active, because it competes for space with the part of the brain that we'll talk about later, which is responsible for thinking and planning. But if your amygdala is overactive, you are going to continue to do things that are not helpful to you. So if you are in a fight with someone, if you're about to do something reckless, I want you to remember this lecture, and I want you to remember this idea that you need to let your amygdala calm down. Once your amygdala calms down, you can make different decisions than you might normally make. Another part of the limbic system is the hippocampus, and this is largely responsible for forming memories. The way I always think about this is if there was a hippo on campus, you would remember it, right? I would remember if there was a hippo on campus. So remembering that the hippocampus is largely responsible for forming memories. This is getting at the different lobes of the brain. So the frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and temporal. We're going to talk about these in just a minute. These are the 4 lobes again. Make sure that you memorize these. Like I said, some of this is just going to be memorization. So memorizing the 4 lobes of the brain. That cerebral cortex is that thin outer layer of the cerebrum. It is the largest part of the forebrain. And then we have these 4 lobes and 2 halves connected by the corpus callosum. The occipital lobes are located at the back of the head. So right here is the occipital lobe. And it helps you process visual stimuli. So when stimuli comes in through your eyes, the actual processing of what you're seeing isn't happening in your eyes. It's happening in your brain, right? Your central nervous system, your brain is what's making sense of everything, not your senses themselves. So the information from your brain is actually processed in the very back of your brain. And then we have the parietal lobes, which are located on each side of the cerebral hemisphere. So parietal lobes. And these are responsible for processing bodily sensations, and they contain the somatosensory cortex. The frontal lobe is located just behind your forehead. So this is the frontal lobe. This is huge. Our frontal lobes in humans are very, very big. And this is essentially the executive center of the brain. So this is the part of your brain that's responsible for higher mental functions. It also contains the motor cortex. So we talked about the amygdala a while ago, right? The amygdala starts getting activated when you're in an argument with someone. The frontal lobe is the part of your brain that when you calm down, you say, wow, that really impacted my relationship in X, Y, or Z way. Or, wow, I wonder what that did to how they think about me. That part of your brain that's responsible for thinking, for foresight, for planning, thinking through the future. When you think about what major you want to be in, right? What you might want to do with your life. These are times when you're using the frontal lobe, when you're thinking about, well, what do I want that to actually look like in my life? How might that actually look? What would that be like on a daily basis for me? What would I need in order to accomplish that, right? These are higher mental functions. And then we have the temporal lobe, which is right here, kind of at the bottom. And the temporal lobe is beneath and behind the frontal lobes, and it's involved in auditory stimuli like sound. So like I said before, right? Noise comes in your ears, but you're not making sense of the noise in your ear. Your brain is what's making sense of it. Your brain is what makes sense of everything happening in your body, which is why the brain is so important. And why if something goes wrong, or if you have lesions or things like that, you start to have serious problems. So thinking about that, we have Broca's area. So Paul Broca was a French surgeon, and he was really a pioneer when we're thinking about languages in areas of the brain. And he discovered one of the most important things that we know about our brain and about language. So he had this 51-year-old patient who was admitted to his ward with gangrene in his leg. The patient understood what he heard, but wasn't able to speak. He had very, very limited ability to speak, and it was basically limited to one word, tan, which he said over and over and over again. The patient died a few days after being admitted. And when they did an autopsy on this man's brain, what they found is that there was an egg-shaped part of the brain that had degenerated. And they concluded that this part of the brain, Broca's area, named after Paul Broca, is essential to producing speech. Our ability to say the things we want to say in the way that we want to say them is related to Broca's area. Then we have Wernicke. This is named after a German researcher named Karl Wernicke. And this is Wernicke's area is in the left temporal lobe. And this is responsible for our ability to comprehend language in written or spoken form. So our ability to actually, when we read a book, it's the difference between seeing a bunch of words on a page and being able to understand what those words mean together. Or when someone says something to you, it's the difference between hearing the different syllables in words and being able to actually understand what they're saying. I'm sure y'all have had the experience where you say a word so many times that it starts to lose meaning, right? Wernicke's area is essentially responsible for making meaning, comprehending these things. This is a great slide to just print or keep on hand write it down. I'm a big fan of sometimes rewriting things that are really important in your own writing, so you just get the information in a different way. You don't need to rewrite everything, but this might be one that would be helpful too. So these are the different lobes: the occipital lobe, related to vision, parietal lobe, frontal lobe, and temporal lobe. And this just gives a brief breakdown of the different functions that they serve. So moving on to the midbrain. The forebrain, like we talked about, is kind of the biggest center. This is the midbrain, which as you can see is much, much smaller. And this is a part of the brain that lies on top of the hindbrain and below the forebrain. And this is part of the composition of the brain stem. So the reticular formation is basically this web-like formation of neurons. And this is responsible for regulating sleep, wake, arousal, alertfulness, motor activity. As you can see, motor activity is involved in a lot of different parts of the brain, right? Like I said, it's not just one part. But this is also partially responsible for your ability to attend to certain stimuli while filtering out others. I'm the kind of person, if you turn on an episode of Friends while I'm reading, I cannot pay attention to what I'm reading for the life of me. Or Bob's Burgers, or, if you turn on something interesting. But if you turn on a sports game, I can absolutely ignore that to read, right? Because certain things we can filter out while others we need to attend to. There might be other people that are the complete opposite, right? They don't care. They can have an episode of Friends on in the background, but if you put on the game, they can't not watch it, right? They have to pay attention to that. Then we're looking at the hindbrain. And this is the oldest part of the brain from an evolutionary perspective. So in terms of what developed first as a species, the hindbrain is the oldest part. It has the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. The medulla is responsible for automatic processes of the autonomic nervous system. So this is responsible for a lot of things like breathing, regulating your blood pressure and your heart rate. This is the part of the brainstem that connects to the spinal cord to the higher regions of the brain. So like I talked about, right, multiple things are involved in what we take for granted as being simple and easy. There's multiple parts of the brain responsible for things like breathing, but the medulla is one of the ones that really has those automatic processes, that autonomic nervous system that we talked about, right? Automatic. It's happening without even thinking about it. And the pons is involved in regulating wakefulness and sleep. So the medulla, pons, and midbrain all together create the brainstem. In the hindbrain, we also have the cerebellum, which when you look at this is the large light green structure in the diagram. And this receives messages from muscles, tendons, joints, structures in our ear. And the cerebellum is responsible for controlling our coordination, our movement, our motor skills. So there are diseases of the cerebellum, and they really have an impact on your ability to balance, your ability to coordinate movement, things like that. When I imagine the cerebellum, I always imagine the cerebellum as kind of a balance beam, because what the cerebellum does is it's what's responsible for helping you cross that balance beam, right? So if you're having problems with your cerebellum, you're going to have a lot of problems with coordinating movement, coordinating balance, things like that. And we also think that it's responsible for memory in some capacity. So our memory is, processed in several different areas, but their cerebellum is one area where it might also be important. I encourage you, we're not going to cover section 3.5. I highly encourage you, like I said, please watch the videos. And please also see if there are other videos that are interesting to you, that you enjoy, that if there's a specific topic that you feel like was just kind of hard or didn't make a lot of sense, I highly encourage you to watch some YouTube videos about it. There are people out there that are so fun and so good at talking about these things and doing these things. I also encourage you to read this part of your textbook. Really make sure that you understand it. There's some really interesting stories in there as well. There's a story of a woman in 1990. She went into cardiac arrest and was revived, but essentially her brain had atrophied. And her parents didn't want to take her off life support because she would do things like move and groan at times. And this was a huge court case where the husband essentially said she wouldn't want to be alive like this, and the parents said she was alive. And so much of this really has to do with how her brain was working, right? These parts of her brain that are responsible for thinking and planning and reasoning and like making her who she was were essentially unable to function. But the parts responsible for basic arousal may have been better able to work, right? And so there's some really, really interesting examples of how the brain impacts people. And the way that we found these out have been just through really interesting things that have happened. There was a man who had a railroad spike that got lodged into his brain. And that's how we discovered partially what was responsible for personality and making us who we are. And so there's a lot of interesting ways that we found out how the brain works, because there are just people similar to Broca's area, right? Where they had these weird symptoms. And then later we found out there was a part of their brain that had a lesion or wasn't working the same as other things were. So I highly encourage you to please watch the videos, see if there are extra videos. I will be back into town very, very shortly before the test, like the day of the test. So please make sure that you're watching these things. You can also post in eLearn if you're wanting to connect with each other, ask questions, things like that, as you're trying to navigate all of this, because this is a very dense chapter. If you need anything, please reach out. I'll have limited access to email, but I will be checking them when I get back as well. And I hope y'all have a good afternoon. Bye.